Hello, hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is your girl Mitzi, and this is Mitzi. Let's think about it. Today, we are thinking about why good is greater than great. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, that's a thinker. And thankfully for me, I have Jim here who's going to help us really think about this. So, Jim, when you hear that phrase, what does it really mean to you?
Well, first of all, Mitzi, thanks for having me on. Um, so, good is greater than great actually comes from a eulogy I wrote for my father. And what it's about is that we have this idea that in order to be a great person, you need to have great accomplishments, great titles, right? You need to have amassed a fortune. You need to have, done some major thing, won a battle, right? Started a corporation, been a
Yeah.
CEO, been a general, whatever. That's what we attribute to greatness. We put up statues. We don't put up statues to working people. We put up
Yeah.
statues to bosses, right? People with big titles. We put up statues to generals. We put up statues to builders. My father was none of those things. He was a leader. He was quite a good leader, but he wasn't. Never had a great title. At one point, for several years, he led his union local in Philadelphia. He was a newspaper pressman. He printed newspapers. That's what he did. And so he ran a local. It was a large local, and it encompassed quite a few publications and whatnot in the Philadelphia area. So it was a big deal. But this is not the stuff that you would erect a statue to. But in
Yeah.
his way, he was a really good person, right? And because he was a good person, he was a great leader. His greatness came from his goodness, not his title, not his great accomplishments or anything like that. So that's what I mean by good can be greater than great.
I like that. I like that. It seems like you have to tap into gratitude, you know what I mean? And appreciate where you are now because you don't realize your contributions do matter. So appreciate your life, appreciate where you are at right now because what you said is absolutely right. And it's sad to say that so many people feel that they need to leave a legacy. And that's the only way to leave a legacy is to have a statue, to have something great to leave behind that for many people will be affected, like growing a company, becoming a CEO, or opening up something. You know what I mean? So I
Yeah.
absolutely agree that sadly, some people feel like, okay, well, if I can contribute a bench to a park or some money to a library, that's at least the best I can do and it'll be good enough. But it's like, no, what you've already contributed into life is good enough. What you've already lived in your life, what you've learned in your life is good enough. So, what are some ways that you have learned how to like tap into this?
Yeah. First off, that was beautifully put. So thank you. The well, I'm glad you brought up legacy. That's an important word. So I'm a leadership coach and consultant and speaker and writer, and I talk about what goes into great leadership, my company's guidance for greatness.
Mhm.
And when I talk about great leadership, I also talk about legacy. Great leaders do seek to leave a legacy, but here's the legacy they seek to leave. It's not a park bench, right? It's not a library wing. It's nothing like that. It's they great leaders beget great leaders. In other words, part of leadership, it really flows naturally. You don't even really have to make an effort. It just happens, even when you're not thinking about it. When you're a great leader, you inspire others, you model behaviors, you mentor people, you coach people, you help people, and they in turn become great leaders. The more intentionally you do it, the more impact you have and the more permanent it is. Right. So I urge people to do that with a great deal of intention, to very conscientiously beget leaders themselves. But then when they do that, those new leaders go on to beget more new leaders and it increases exponentially, right? So it's like compound. So it just keeps growing and growing and growing. So that legacy is really key. If leaders, so we don't just need great leaders in this world, we need a lot more than we have, but
Yeah.
we need them to very, very consciously, very intentionally create new leadership for the future so that today's young leaders, they need to guide today's young leaders become the next generation of great leaders.
Absolutely. I think that is a very valid point because one thing that really stuck with me, I had to write it down real quick because I didn't want to lose a thought, was intention. Goodness gracious. When you have intention in your actions and your motive and what you do in your day to day, you will always be a leader, like you said, because there's no way you cannot have intention to do something and it not trigger somebody else to see you and what you're doing as if, huh, maybe they're onto something. Huh. Maybe I need to follow along because there's a lot of there's a lot of people who are looking for a sense of direction, who are looking for that guidance. And there's a lot of people who are just willing to just show up and mess everything up. You know what I mean? They just
Mhm.
scramble it up instead of actually guiding and teaching or being intentional in what they're doing. And people forget that. And then they end up following the wrong people. And it's so frustrating. I think that's one of my biggest pet peeves. So what is your biggest pet peeve, if you don't mind me asking?
Oh boy, wow! This program isn't long enough. I've got a lot of pet peeves, but that is one of them actually. The idea that I mean something we don't recognize. It's easier to destroy than to build. It is easier to stir up chaos, right, than to stir up change. There's a difference, right? There's a difference between
Mm,
people who stir up chaos and people who stir up change. People just do it for the sake of doing it. I drive my poor wife nuts because I'm always saying that bad is stronger than good, and she doesn't want to believe it, although she's coming around. And I say that not as a pessimist, but as a realist. Bad is stronger than good because it's easier to be bad. When you're bad, you don't have to follow the rules. When you're good, you have to follow the rules, right? You
you're
don't cheat, you
absolutely
don't
right.
lie, you don't steal, and that is a strength. But it's a cheesy strength. It's a tawdry strength, and that means that good needs to be faster, needs to be more agile, more clever, more on the ball, constantly vigilant. And that's
Yeah.
how we defeat that badness in the world.
Yes, yes. I really like that phrase. It really does speak to you because if you really think about it, you know what I mean? The whole point of the show. If you really think about that phrase alone, it makes you realize being bad is easy. It's a cop out. It's the easy way out. It's that easy button. You remember those commercials that they
Oh
used to
yeah.
have? Those easy buttons and people's lives would change and instantly, but then they also have the chaos that comes with it. They weren't ready for it. I mean, people don't realize that you have to be disciplined to get the good, to be good, to have the good around you, you know what I mean? To work for it, you know? So it's like that value has kind of also been dismissed, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Does that make sense? Am
Yeah,
I,
absolutely.
am I saying in the right way, right?
Yeah.
So it's curious. Why did you start, you wrote your this story for, I mean, for your father, and why did you decide to just speak it out and share this with the rest of the world?
Because that's what I do. So I one of the things I do is
Besides
I
that.
well I have a blog and a podcast, and I write an essay every week, and I read it aloud and I record it and put it out there. And so my father passed about a year and a half ago, and I wrote a piece inspired by him, and that became his eulogy. And and it really fit with what I do because I wrote about leadership. That's what I write about all the time. And the thing about writing about leadership, I sometimes refer to myself as a leadership philosopher because that's how I think of myself. That doesn't work in marketing, so I don't use it very often.
Yeah, I
Um,
don't recommend
but
it.
yeah, but that's what I am. I do a lot of, you'll appreciate this, thinking about what it means to be a leader and what that means in the world and how that looks. And one of the things is about leadership, about writing about leadership, is when you really get into it, when you think of it as a philosophy, it's actually a moral philosophy. You're writing about morality. Leadership
Yeah,
is just a proxy for other things. Right now, there's a gazillion leadership coaches and consultants and gurus and books and this and that,
absolutely.
and a lot of them are very valuable. Valuable, people offer valuable things to the world. But when you really boil it down, the reason there's so much stuff about leadership right now is because it is a proxy for that lack of moral direction that you were gesturing toward just a minute ago, right? That idea that You really want to be good in the world. It's actually more productive. And we put it in terms of production and business because people want to get behind that. But ultimately, when you think about it, leadership is just a stand-in for other things about how to live your life. You can't be a great leader if you're not a great person. That's because you have to have integrity, and integrity has to be whole. It has to be
Yes.
every part of your life. You can't act one way in the workplace and another way at home. You can't act one way in one part of the workplace and another way in another part of the workplace. It has to
Yes.
be universal. It has to be who you are. And who you are has to be reflected, and this is really important, in your behavior. There's no
Hmm.
such thing as being good deep down inside, and that's okay. Right? Do you ever hear that when somebody says, well, they mean
Yes.
well? I don't care. They're not doing well. They're doing a horrible thing. I don't care what they mean to
Yes.
do. They're doing a horrible thing. Your behavior is who you are. That's what your character is.
Yes, I think that's such a valid point because you hear from so many people. Well, I don't know you specifically, but to say this, but for me, I've heard so many stories about trauma, and you always hear that statement at the end. Well, there's always an excuse for the behavior because they're really good people deep down. Really? Are they? If they're molesting people, you know what I mean? Like in those
Yeah.
big drastic situations, like no, it goes back down to, like you said, character and just having that integrity. Oh my goodness, integrity. You cannot have integrity without honorability, without accountability. Goodness, you have to have everything align with that integrity because then what are you then? You know what I mean?
Right.
What really are you? You are just a chameleon, just adapting to whatever environment that you're in, not really knowing who
Mm.
you are. You know what I mean? Because people are always talking about being adaptable, and that's one thing that I actually have thought about too. But if you really think about, you can be adaptable, but once you lose that integrity in any situation that you're in, then you no longer have that moral grounding anymore, in my opinion. I mean, and for you, what do you think?
Yeah. I mean, integrity is something I talk and write about a lot. Um, so I often compare, there's two types of integrity. There's physical integrity, and then there's what you might call human or moral integrity. So like a
Okay.
chair has physical integrity, right?
Yeah.
You wouldn't sit on a chair that doesn't have integrity, right? It
Yeah.
has to be solid. It has to be whole. You wouldn't sit on a two-legged chair. All right. You wouldn't sit on a chair where all the screws were missing, right? It has to be
Mm-mm.
solid, and it has to be dependable. But
Yeah.
it's exactly the same for moral integrity, for human integrity. Exactly the same. It has to be whole. Like I said before, it has to be every part of your life. You can't turn it on and turn it off. There's no such thing as compartmentalizing integrity, right? It has to be who you are and how you behave. It has to be solid. It has to be real. It has to be there. Again, it has to be part of how you behave. It has to manifest in your actions. And then finally, if you have integrity, you are dependable. People will
Yeah.
trust you. So
Yeah, that's
it's
very true.
exactly the same thing. So yeah, integrity is key, and it isn't something you can just flip on, flip off, have it here, not there. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, I'm curious. When did you start tapping into this? You know what I mean? It seems like this has been really engraved in you for a very long time. So when did this really become a reality check for you that you had to dive deeper?
That's a new question for me, and no one has ever asked me that one. So it's
Ah,
not
not
something I've
that
actually thought.
thinker.
Yeah, so thank you. I appreciate that. Um, well, I did mention my dad, right? So I guess early
Yeah.
on, because my dad was a man of integrity. He wasn't perfect, no one is, but he was a man of deep integrity. And so was my mom, actually. And so I was raised with it. A lot of it has to do with my leadership journey. I often think of things in terms of my leadership journey. I was a leader at a very young age, like age 11 or 12 or something. I was forced into a leadership position in Boy Scouts I wasn't even ready for. And
Oh,
that's been my
wow.
whole life. By 18, I actually had employees. I was a boss. I had the power to hire
Okay.
and fire. And that's been my whole life. And I never really thought about it much. I was just a good gut leader, right? I wasn't
Yeah.
bad. I was actually pretty good, but I just kind of gutted my way through it. And then I became an academic. For 30 years, I worked in higher ed, and I was a faculty leader, naturally enough. And at one point, I was asked to become the founding dean of a school within a university. And
Oh,
so okay. So I said, I'll do that. And I started working on it. And I realized putting together a school was easy, right? You just put this with that. It's no big deal, nuts and bolts. What
Yeah.
was hard was getting it up and running and keeping it running. That requires leadership. And I needed leadership on a different level than what I had. Gut leadership wasn't going to do it for me anymore. The stakes were way higher. Now I had all these employees, all these students, all these things to worry about. And I didn't really have any models. My bosses were bosses, and I make a distinction there between bosses and leaders. You can't be
Yeah.
a boss if you can't be a leader if you're a boss. They're different
Yeah.
things. And my peers had no idea what they were doing. I imitated them for a while. That was a disaster. So I started studying leadership as a discipline. I started thinking about it. And I guess that's really when I started formulating some of these ideas. My first real insight into leadership was I don't even know how it came to me. One day I realized that every single challenge I had as a leader, when I had to find a solution, I tapped into my teaching skills. I spent decades in the classroom. I was a classroom teacher. And I realized that every leadership challenge is really just a teaching challenge in disguise. That every teacher is, in fact, a leader, and every leader is, in fact, a teacher. And those two things, there's really, aside from title, right, and some certain circumstances, superficials, there's really
Yeah.
no difference between the two. And that's when I realized that's when my thinking really took off because I had some interesting ideas about teaching too. So it just kind of transferred over to leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you have all of that experience, it makes sense how it just became naturally to you. Then the thought of it became naturally. The understanding of just following others and figuring it out as you go came naturally, just as it does to many people. But it does come to a point where you have to just stop and realize, you know what? This is an obstacle now. Now I have to try to figure out how to handle this obstacle that I never encountered before. And that's when you dived into leadership and learning more into the discipline of it. And I appreciate you saying that because more people don't acknowledge like, you have to go deeper sometimes. If you really want to know the answer to something, you really have to go deeper and have that ambition to really be like, I shall find it. You know what I mean? Like
Mm-hmm.
no matter what. And I think people have lost that ambition in life. You know what I mean? Where they lost that gratitude also, where in everything that they experience in life, where they lose that leadership, I mean, in my opinion, that's my opinion. And what is your opinion on that?
Yeah, no, I agree. It's easy to do because bad is stronger than good. And like you said, it's
Yeah,
easier, right? It's
yeah,
just
yeah,
easier to not make those choices that you would make as a leader. And that's why I say there's a distinction between leaders and bosses. I always say that there's very few bosses who are actual leaders and even fewer who are great leaders. But there's plenty of leaders, even great leaders, who are not and never will be a boss. They'll never have that title. Boss is a title, boss is an attitude. So I make a distinction, very key distinction between bosses and leaders. Leaders actually want to get things done. It's the right thing to do. And it is a moral stance. And I'll use that word, morality. It is a moral stance. Bossing is about yourself. You make everything about yourself.
yeah. It's that superiority, it's that power high that people get when they just know that they have that sense of control. But in actuality, when you're a leader, it's for the greater good. You know what I mean? There's a
Mhm.
sacrifice, there's an understanding of the bottom line. And I think that's the reason why people can appreciate a true leader or put somebody who has that leadership skill because they've gained the experience. They know the hard grit that got into that. And I mean, I think that's the reason why a lot of people are also, you know, in jobs, they have such a hard time respecting their boss because they're not leading them the way that they feel like they should be leading. And there's a lot of turnover in companies as well because of that. And I wonder why employers don't acknowledge the fact like maybe the issue for the high turnover rate is because of the bosses. You know what I mean? Like, isn't that something to think about? Like, shouldn't
It's
you
almost
really?
always the case. It's rarely anything else. I mean, people will stay
Exactly.
in a tough job for low pay to work with great leadership. They do it all the time.
Yeah.
They will not stay in a even in a high paying job if the leadership is lousy, if they have bad bosses. And you see this all the time. If there's a lot of turnover, there's a very high percentage chance, I'm not going to put a number on it, but it's real high percentage chance that it's because the leadership is poor. There might be other factors, but that is going to be a major, major factor. You know,
Mhm.
it's kind of like, I use the analogy of, you're sitting in a tub and the water's draining, and instead of plugging the drain, you just keep adding more water, right?
Yeah, that
And and
doesn't.
and, and eventually the water gets cold, and then it's miserable, and then your experience in the tub is miserable, right? This is exactly what employers do. They're sitting in their tub of employees, we'll say. It's a weird image. We'll maybe erase that from your mind. But they've got all these employees. The employees start leaving, and instead of figuring out what the cause is, they just hire new employees. But eventually it gets harder and harder to get good employees to work at that place. So the employees get colder and colder, right? To use that analogy. And
Yeah.
the next thing you know, it's not a very good situation for the whole business, and everything's going downhill, when really all they needed to do was plug the drain. And more often than not, that has to do with them stopping whatever they're doing and becoming better leaders.
Right, exactly. And then it's a ripple effect. Exactly. It comes down to also it being having a ripple effect in your life because if you don't show leadership, then how is somebody else going to acknowledge leadership or duplicate the leadership? Because, like you said earlier, so many people they just copy what they think is acceptable or what is right for the area or the time because everybody does that depending on, you fill in the blank, right? Fill in the blank and you can do that. So my question to you, if you could have any superpower, what would your superpower be?
Any superpower. Wow.
Any superpower.
Any superpower. Does this have to be one that has already been thought of, or can I come with my own?
Whatever you want. There's no wrong answers on my show.
I mean, I would love to have the superpower to be able to think things a little more clearly than I do and convey them more clearly than I do. I like the superpower of ultimate clarity, which is the
Mm,
toughest thing in communication, is to be as
mm.
clear as possible. It's not going to save someone from robbing, keep someone from robbing a bank or any of that. Maybe
It
it
would be
will,
your
but
superpower.
it would be mine. Yeah.
But I think it would also be frustrating because if you had that superpower, you would have the clarity to deal with people and everything, but nobody would have the clarity for you and how you react and handle life. So people are gonna just probably sometimes be a little standoff, like, "Oh, Jim is weird," but you're just like, "Oh, I'm already beyond this because I already know." Like,
Well, I didn't mean clarity of knowing. I mean clarity of communication.
oh,
So
okay,
being
well
able
that
to
makes
to,
more
to be
sense.
clearer in
Okay.
my in expressing myself.
Okay, well,
I
thank
work
you.
very
Thank you for
hard
the
at it.
clarity. See,
Yes.
you're already working on that
See,
clarity communication
there we
power.
go. That's a
See,
perfect case
it's
in point.
achievable.
Case in point.
Like you put it on your resume, superpower, clarity. Oh, that's funny. So I guess to start wrapping up the show, what can be some lasting words of wisdom that you can leave us off with?
Well, so the words of wisdom. I'm always stumped by this because I always feel like I have to say something so profound. And the thing about leadership is it's not that hard conceptually. The principles are really simple. I boil it down to four, right? You need, in a particular order, they build off each other. The first thing you need is character. That's where the integrity comes in, that behavior. The second one is communication, which we just talked about, your ability to communicate. And the ultimate part of communication is clarity. Clarity trumps everything. The third thing is the ability to compromise, that give and take, very transactional, but that give and take. And that leads to the fourth and most important, and that is collaboration. That is the ultimate goal of a leader, is to build a team that works together toward a common goal and maybe even brings other teams into it. But that is what you want to do as a leader. You want to collaborate. So it's character, communication, compromise, and then collaboration. And if you have those four things, that'll put you on the road to leadership. And you got to have them in that order. You got to work on yourself first. You got to work on your character first. Otherwise, that self-awareness is absolutely key to becoming a great leader. But then, that's easy. What's hard about leadership, and we've already talked about this a little bit, it's implementing it. and doing it and continuing to do it even look as you get more power. Power has a way of, I mean, there was an article I think in the Atlantic Monthly that was power causes brain damage, and it was looking at studies where it showed that the more power people had, they lost certain natural abilities, such as the ability to empathize, the ability to communicate, the ability to listen, which is part of communication. These kinds of those what we call soft skills, which by the way
Ah,
are the hardest skills of all. Those soft skills go away the higher you climb the ladder, the more power you get, and so you have to actually counteract that. That's really hard. That
yeah.
takes work, that takes effort, but it's totally worth it because not only will you be a better rounded person and a better person and feel better about yourself, but your people, your team will be better. They won't be stressed out. They won't be taking that stress home. Their families will be better. And your organization, your business, your nonprofit, your university, whatever it is, will also be more productive.
Mhm.
So it's a win-win across the board. It just takes work and concentration and we said it before, intentionality.
Yeah, and implementing it very good. Those are some great words to keep on thinking and to leave us off with. And I know words of wisdom, that phrase just it throws people off because I've had many guests say, that means I have to like really be something. Like, no, you have wisdom. We just don't consider it wisdom because we are always thinking and processing and developing and enhancing it. But
Mm-hmm.
that's what makes it wisdom because wisdom is always enhancing, wisdom is always growing and evolving. It's learning, it's learned. It's being able to grasp it and move forward with it and activate it in your life. And when you're able to activate words in your life, like leadership and care in your character and your self-awareness, like yeah, you absolutely need that to be, I guess, a better person or a better leadership. You know what I mean? However, whatever title label you want to claim to be, is just do it. Do it. Goodness gracious, just do it. So yes, that's a great point. Thank you so much, Jim. I really appreciate it. And if anybody
Sure.
would like to know more about Jim and all that he has to offer, I have his photo and his website on mine so that you can continue on thinking because he has a lot of great content to keep on thinking. So with that being said, bye.